So we will go ahead and get started. I'm Cornell Clayton, Director of the Foley Institute here at WSU. And on behalf of the Institute, I want to welcome you out to our event today. This is part of our ongoing series this year on the midterm elections. And today we're fortunate to have with us James Curry, who's an Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Utah. He studies politics and the policy making with a particular focus on the U.S. Congress. He's the author of two books, Legislating in the Dark, published by the University of Chicago in 2015, and The Limits of Party, which was co-authored with Francis Lee, also by the University of Chicago in 2020. Now, Francis Lee, you might remember, was here last week with us, so we're getting the second part of that duo. James's research has been covered by the New York Times, the Atlantic, the Washington Post, and many other major news organizations. He received his PhD from the University of Maryland in 2011 and previously worked on Capitol Hill in the offices of Congressman Dan Lipinski and in the House Appropriations Committee. Join me now in welcoming Dan Curry to the Foley Institute.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks to the Foley Institute for bringing me out. This is really great. Thanks to Cornell and Richard for getting everything organized. I've never been up to Pullman before. It's really pretty. And I'm excited to talk to you all today about this. So what I'm going to talk to you today is about how do majority parties actually get things done in Congress? And then with some thoughts on what does that mean about what we may or may not see in the next Congress after the midterms. What can we expect from a Congress that in all likelihood is going to be equally divided with Democrats in control of maybe a part of Washington and Republicans in control of other parts of Washington. So for those of you who saw the talk last week, and I watched it so that I wouldn't repeat anything that Francis already told you, is that, as Francis told you, every 2 years, Democrats and Republicans in this country run campaigns promising the moon and the stars to voters. They tell us all about the things that they're going to do, all these great big things they'll do if we just put them in charge. But inevitably, every single Congress and every single majority party that's elected in Congress underdelivers on these lofty promises. Take the Democrats today. After the 2020 elections, they were given unified control of the House, of the Senate, and of the presidency. And they came with very lofty goals. Among other things, Democrats promised to expand COVID-19 relief policies and provide $2,000 stimulus checks to every American, to usher through a whole host of electoral reforms, from eliminating partisan gerrymandering to establishing automatic voter registration and vote by mail throughout the country, to overturning the Citizens United Supreme Court decision and reestablishing pre-clearance for state changes to voting laws. They also wanted to enable the federal government to negotiate drug prices, expand civil rights in the Civil Rights Act to apply to sexual orientation and gender identity, to provide permanent legal status to dreamers and other immigrants, to take steps to eliminate the gender pay gap, to usher forth a $500 billion investment in transportation infrastructure and another $500 billion investment in energy and climate change infrastructure. They also wanted to put through a package that dealt with all sorts of what they called at-home infrastructure, including universal pre-kindergarten, paid family and medical leave, and an expanded child tax credit. And on guns, they wanted to establish universal background checks and a ban assault weapons. This is a huge agenda, but this is what parties do. And of course, most of these agenda items have gone nowhere. In fact, the vast majority of them, maybe we saw some action in the House of Representatives, but we've not seen any real enacted policymaking to address most of the things here. But it's important to remember that even if parties underdeliver, it's not as if they achieve nothing. Every 2 years, Congress passes a substantial amount of laws. And every 2 years, the majority claims victory on some of the things it seeks to achieve in Washington. Now, this is a lesson that tends to run contrary to what most of us are told about Congress and about Washington, D.C. Most of us are told that Congress sits in its chairs and gets nothing done, that it can't do anything, that every year, every passing year, Congress enacts fewer and fewer laws. But this is a conclusion that's driven by some degree by how we measure and how we count legislating. Indeed, if you simply count the number of bills that Congress passes every 2 years, it looks like Congress is doing less and less over time. That's what this blue dotted line is showing you. It's literally just the number of laws enacted by Congress every year from the late 1940s until a couple of years ago. However, what this is obscuring is how much stuff is packed into these laws. This red line shows you the number of pages of new statute that is included in these laws passed by Congress over time. In other words, while Congress is passing fewer and fewer laws, it's passing bigger and bigger laws that do more things. In the 1940s and 1950s, most laws were relatively short and they accomplished one thing. Today, we're in an era of congressional omnibus legislating, in which things are packaged together into these large legislative packages that include 5, 6, sometimes 20 or 25 different things that in the past would have passed individually, but now pass as one big lump. In fact, by this metric, Congress is more productive at making new law than it was 50 or 60 years ago, and it's no more or less productive than it was 30 or 40 years ago. It's also a case that nearly all of this legislation is bipartisan as well, which also runs contrary to what we're usually told. Typically told that Congress no longer does bipartisanship, that it's caught up in bitter partisan fighting all the time. What this graph shows you, what every one of these dotted little gray dots shows you, is the percent of members of the House of Representatives that voted in support of everything that became law from 1973 until 2016. Every single thing. The black dotted line shows you the trend over time, essentially the average over time. On average, 85 to 90 to even 95% of members of the House of Representatives vote to pass the things that become law. And this is an average that has not changed much since the 1970s. In the 1970s, about 90% of the House voted to support things that became law on average. And in this decade, about 90% of the House of Representatives votes to support things that become law. And this is a pattern that we see about the same in the Senate. The Senate votes on fewer things, but on the things it votes on, overwhelmingly things that pass get 80 to 85 senators to support it on average. So how is it that parties are still getting some things done? How is it that Congress is still getting some things done, even in what we recognize today as a very hyper-partisan, difficult political environment where it's hard to forge agreements between people on the left and the right? The answer, very simply, is compromise, which is something we assume that people can't do in Washington anymore, but it turns out they actually do. Even today, the pathway to majority party success in the legislative process is through cultivating bipartisan support. In our book, Francis Lee and I categorize the pathways that majority parties in Washington use to obtain their legislative successes. We found that there are essentially 4 major pathways that they use. One, the first, is to seek broad support for their proposals. Typically, this involves putting forth a broadly popular policy idea as a key item on their agenda, and in other words, identifying something that their party wants to do that there's substantial support on the other side of the aisle to do as well. The second path is what we call to back down or backing down, in which the majority party first puts forth something that is particularly partisan and contentious, but through the legislative process and as things unfold, backs off of the more contentious, extreme, or controversial aspects of what they want to do until they can get enough votes from the other side of the aisle to support it as well. The third we call a bipartisan log roll. In this case, the majority party sticks to its guns on what it wants to do, but incorporates things that the other party also wants to do in that same issue space. And the last, and in fact, what was, as you'll see, the least common, represents the only form of single-party partisan lawmaking among these pathways. This is the steamroll. In these instances, the majority finds ways to pass their party's preferred policy over the persistent opposition of the minority or of the other party. We take a look at all the major legislative efforts that majority parties engaged in over a long period of time, from 1985 to 2020, to see how these pathways are used. I think Francis talked a little bit about this data last week, but it bears repeating. We have about 284 agenda items, stated agenda items that the parties and its leaders said they wanted to do when they won majorities in Washington. We typically take these from leadership-introduced legislation and from the things that the leaders put on the agenda in their opening speeches at each Congress. About half of these agenda items ended up in some form of legislative success, 144, about 51% of the things that they said they wanted to do over this 35-year period. We then take each one of these successes and put them into these categories. Did they seek broad support? Did they back down? Did they engage in a log roll? Did they steamroll their opponents? Efforts can be in one or the one category. You can have them seek broad support and have to back down. You can see them back down and log roll. Most things fit into just one, but there's some stuff that fits into most. It fits into more than one. Here's what it looks like over time. Here's what we found. What we found first and foremost is that the parties overwhelmingly succeed in finding ways to cultivate support for their ideas from members of Congress on the other side of the aisle. By far, the most common pathway to success was to back down. That's over here in this side. That is, start with a clearly partisan proposal, but gain bipartisan support for it by backing off the more contentious aspects of the proposal until enough members of the minority can support it. In fact, 53% of all successes that majority parties have on the things that they said they wanted to do in Washington after taking power happened in this way. The second most common pathway was for the majority party to seek broad support for its proposals. In other words, to propose something that is already broadly supported and already has bipartisan support across the country or in Washington. These things are not very controversial even from the start, they just have to work out the details. In fact, when you add bipartisan log rolls to this mix, what we see is just 14% of all majority party legislative successes in Congress since 1995 have been achieved through some means of building bipartisan support. This 14% ends up being less than 20 total legislative efforts since 1985. Not very many when you're talking about 144 successful efforts out of 284 attempts. We also find the majority parties have not been steamrolling or using any of these specific tactics more or less over time. These graphs show the trends in the use of each of these pathways from 1985 to 2020. The only thing you can say here is that maybe backing down has become ever so slightly less common in recent years, but it hasn't been replaced by the majority steamrolling the other side more. Instead, it's been replaced more by majorities strategically picking broadly popular ideas to try to put on their agenda. In other words, we don't see any sort of trend towards more partisan and contentious lawmaking, or majority parties that are more able to or more interested in jamming something down their opponent's throats. Instead, things are largely the same now as they have been throughout this time period. Steamrolls aren't even the norm during periods of unified party control in Washington. These figures show the percentages of each of these pathways during periods of unified party control, like we have right now with the Democrats in control of the House, Senate, and presidency, of divided government, where Congress is controlled by one party and the presidency is controlled by the other, or years of divided chambers, where one party controls the House and the other party controls the Senate. What we see is that when control of American institutions is divided between the parties, backing down is by far the most common approach. In these instances, the majority in Congress, or if it's split chambers, the two majorities in Congress start out by putting out their more partisan proposals, their more contentious, their more hardline proposals, and then work to back down so they can find something both can agree to. This makes sense in the context of divided government. Each of them holds some control of the government, and so they want to show what they would do if they had control for themselves, or what they want you to believe that they would do if they had control for themselves. And then they can be like, well, political reality is such that we can't. But it's not as if during unified government they just are able to steamroll their opponents all the time. In fact, the big difference during unified government is that rather than backing down all the time, they mainly propose things that they know they can already build bipartisan support for. This is what happened on about 50%, or nearly 50% of the successes that majority parties have when they control all of Washington, is through seeking broad support for ideas that already have some bipartisanship. Even in these instances, steamrolling is only the third most common pathway that they took, and accounted for only about a quarter of their legislative successes. So we've seen these patterns in action over time. We've also seen these patterns in action during this current Congress, during the 117th Congress. Again, Democrats came into Congress with a head full of steam. Despite having some of the narrowest majorities in congressional history, with essentially a 0-seat majority in the Senate, as people in the Senate will say that they have, and about a 5-seat majority in the House, They listed like one of the more ambitious agendas I have ever seen of what they were going to accomplish. And so far, reality has taken its toll, as I already showed you. Democrats have been largely unable to enact legislation on most of these things. However, on some items, on these other items that are left, they still achieved some success. So how have they done it? So the American Rescue Plan is probably their one big shining star steamroll success. It's probably the only one they're going to get. It was a rare steamroll victory for the Democrats. After taking office, the Democrats capitalized on Americans' continued uncertainty and anxiety about the global COVID-19 pandemic and passed their nearly $2 trillion recovery bill over the objections of Republicans. There was a different path there. There were a large number of Republicans who were willing to negotiate on a COVID relief bill. It would have been much smaller than what was in the American Rescue Plan, and the Democrats ultimately decided to go for broke on what they could get by holding their members together rather than working with some of the Republicans in the Senate to craft something that could have gotten broad support. So they steamrolled their way to victory. But after this, everything that the Democrats have accomplished and the Congress has accomplished since then has required some degree of compromise or some degree of moving the needle in a different direction. For instance, maybe their second biggest accomplishment or their second big accomplishment of the Congress, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, was accomplished through first proposing a policy idea in infrastructure, physical infrastructure, that has broad support in Washington throughout the country. Both parties had for years wanted to do something on infrastructure. It was a running gag during the Trump administration that every week was Infrastructure Week, which sort of represented that Republicans wanted to do an infrastructure bill too, they could just never get it done. Biden comes in, the Democrats come in, and they want to do infrastructure too. And what this took was Democrats backing off the more contentious aspects of what they wanted to do, including removing these at-home infrastructure plans and backing off their funding mechanism, which would have caused an increase in corporate taxes, in order to come to a place where Republicans could support a very large amount of infrastructure investment. In fact, one of the larger infrastructure investments in American history. The Inflation Reduction Act did pass on a party line vote. This is the big reconciliation bill that Democrats passed this past summer. However, it still required a ton of backing down and a ton of compromise for them to get there, just only among Democrats. This Inflation Reduction Act was the ultimate result of what started as the Build Back Better plan that Democrats started working on in summer 2021. It was a nearly $3 trillion plan, which have done all sorts of things, from at-home infrastructure to climate change to taxes to you name it. In fact, it was sort of a catch-all bill for a lot of the things on their priority list. By the time this thing whittles down, it's a fraction of that size, and it still accomplishes some big things, including a lot of investment in climate change, some other major efforts to try to scale back inflation, hence the title. But it is a shell of what they initially proposed. And it required backing down, not to get Republicans, but really essentially to get moderate Democrats to be willing to support it. And we also have the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, which is essentially the gun control legislation that Congress passed in the summer. This is ultimately something that looked very different from what Democrats were proposing on guns at the start of the Congress, which was universal background checks, assault weapons bans, and other more aggressive forms of gun control. After a series of shootings, obviously, throughout 2022 and in 2020 and 2021 as well, even Republicans had an interest in trying to do something on guns, but it required Democrats to back off the things that Republicans simply did not find acceptable and get to what both sides could support and pass. Of course, there's been a lot of other major legislation as well, things that weren't on the Democrats' agenda, but that bubbled up throughout the Congress and have worked their way into law. Things like the Chips and Science Act, which had this boost for semiconductor industry in the US, Honoring Our Pact Act, which helped out veterans, COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act, which targeted fighting hate crimes that have been targeted at Asian Americans during the COVID-19 pandemic, and essentially some unclear billions of dollars in Ukrainian aid. I've seen estimates ranging from $13 to $40 billion. I don't think we actually know how much we are committed to spending to Ukraine, but all of this passed with overwhelming bipartisan support. Except The only thing that really represents something other than an effort towards compromise, either among Democrats or across the aisle, is this American Rescue Plan. And this tends to be what most Congresses look like. They tend to feature of each party, or whatever, if there's a single majority party, pushing for the things it wants, but awfully having to back its way into stuff that is less ambitious and more bipartisan. When you really get down to it, steamrolls are neither common nor necessarily represent all of the biggest things that Congress has done over the decades. We often think about major legislative victories should be driven by party agendas. We often think about elections that way, that a party puts forth an agenda, they win an election, and they do the thing. But when you break it down, there really haven't been that many things that actually work that way. And when you look at them very closely, a lot of them really aren't that impressive. Among the 284 agenda priorities that parties set for themselves, just 6%, or 18 in total, resulted in steamroll victories. And even then, just 9 of these steamrolls were actually enacted over the unambiguous opposition from the other party. These include some things that I know Francis talked about last time, so I won't repeat too much, but Democrats' Omnibus Crime Bill in 1993, Motor Voter, or the National Voter Registration Act, the Medicare Modernization Act in 2003, partial birth abortion ban in 2003, PAYGO, which was a series of budget rules that were supposed to eliminate budget deficits, worked really well. The Affordable Care Act, the Dodd-Frank financial reforms, the Republicans' tax reform bill in 2017, and a series of regulation rollbacks that Republicans pushed through Congress in 2017 and 2018. There's a whole other series of steamrolls that look very different. These are not instances of one party jamming things over the continued opposition of the other. These are moments where the opposition party didn't like the idea, opposed it, but then caved or capitulated in the face of public pressure to go along. And these are an interesting set of cases too, that we'll come back to, in the sense that a lot of these represent things that one of the parties didn't want to do but didn't feel like they could oppose. For Republicans, these things often focus on social issues, civil rights, women's rights, where Republicans don't really want to pass or didn't really want to pass this legislation, but felt it was a political embarrassment to continue to oppose it. For Democrats, it tends to involve national defense, because they got rolled repeatedly and had to capitulate and go along with funding for missile defense, military funding, and war spending throughout the Bush years. So, what should we take away from all of this so far? Well, though majority parties are deeply constrained in their ability to pass what they really want, they still nonetheless legislate. It's something of a myth that today in Washington, the majority either gets its way or ends up in gridlock. There is some of that, but there's also plenty of taking steps to achieve successes by seeking bipartisan support. The vast majority of things that happen in Washington happen because the majority party proposes something that's broadly supported throughout the political spectrum, or because they back off the aspects of their proposals that the other side cannot get behind. Only occasionally is steamrolling the opposition the path to victory, and those cases tend to be few and far between. Importantly, because the majority almost always needs to build support from the minority party to get things done, this actually provides a surprising amount of opportunities for minority parties, the party that loses the election, to have a lot of influence over actual policy outcomes, over actual policy substance. In research I'm doing with Andy Ballard, who's a professor at American University, we're advancing and testing a theory of minority party capacity for policy influence in Washington. In other words, we want to understand when and under what circumstances minority parties in Congress have greater or lesser influence over the policies that Congress enacts. We've essentially focused in on 3 factors that we think work together to give the minority party more capacity or less to be involved and to shape policy outcomes. One are constraints placed that are on the majority's ability to act alone. That sometimes the majority can more easily act alone, or have most of the votes and are just able to pick off some minority votes to get what they want. Other times the majority is more constrained, either because they have to deal with supermajoritarian requirements in the Senate, or because they don't have sufficient unity within their own party to push what they want. When the majority is more constrained, this creates opportunities for the minority to involve itself and have the votes to shape the outcome. Second factor, though, is that the minority party's lawmakers need to be unified behind what they want to do on that issue. If the minority is also scattered, the majority may be able to pick off a handful of lawmakers on the other side of the aisle, just enough to push across something that's much closer to what it wants to do. This is the story of the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, the stimulus package that the Obama administration passed right after 2008 elections. Most Republicans were opposed to doing another large stimulus, or at least didn't want to have to vote for it. However, Susan Collins and Olympia Snowe and Arlen Specter, three moderate Republicans among the Senate GOP, were interested and broke with their party and sided with most of what the Democrats had hoped to accomplish. That lack of unity on the other side limited the broader influence that the minority party could have had as a whole over shaping a potential stimulus. Finally, minority party members also need to be motivated to actually want to legislate on an issue. Because on every issue, the minority party has a choice between engaging in the policymaking process and helping shape the outcome. They could do that on literally any policy that they wish, or not engaging and choosing to electioneer on that issue, making it a campaign issue for the next election rather than engaging. When these three things come together, when the majority is constrained, when the minority is unified or relatively unified, and when they want to legislate, what we've found so far is we see a surprising amount of minority party influence over the final substance of legislation. I can give you a couple, this research is ongoing, but I can give you a couple examples that demonstrate this from the most recent Congress, from the current Congress, the 117th. One is that Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, the big infrastructure bill passed last Congress. Democrats initially proposed a massive infrastructure bill, $2.3 trillion that combined physical infrastructure and what they called at-home infrastructure, which included things like billions of dollars for retrofitting older homes, billions of dollars for at-home or community-based care for seniors, and billions of dollars in climate change research. But they didn't have the votes to pass it. They didn't even really have the votes to pass it through the House, much less through the House and the Senate, where they were going to need some Republican votes. Republicans wanted to do some infrastructure. They had the motivation there. It had been hanging out there for 4 years. They weren't able to get it done during the Trump years, and a lot of them really wanted to get it done. But they didn't want to spend $2.3 trillion. They didn't want to do the at-home infrastructure, and they didn't want to fund it with a 7% increase in corporate taxes. Instead, they proposed a much smaller $568 billion physical infrastructure bill that focused almost purely on transportation infrastructure and some electrical grid. And they did this by building what are called gangs, Senate gangs, which sounds notorious. But it's really groups of senators, some on one side of the aisle, some on the other, who figure out what can we agree to that you can also agree to. They came with their proposal, they got in these gangs, fought it out, and they figured out what could we get about 18 senators to agree to, 9 on each side of the aisle. And the final bill looks a lot more like what the Republicans proposed than what the Democrats proposed. It was only a little bit bigger, $715 billion, which is much closer to $568 billion than it is to $2.3 trillion. It included none of the at-home infrastructure Democrats wanted. It didn't have the corporate tax increases. The only big thing that was added to it was that Democrats secured some additional infrastructure for clean water and a little bit more for electric cars than the Republicans were interested in. Otherwise, it was more or less what more centrist more middle of the road Republicans and sort of what we now refer to as establishment Republicans wanted to do on infrastructure. But Democrats wanted to win. They wanted a bipartisan win, especially the Biden administration. They wanted to do infrastructure and they got it done. And it's a good bill, but it isn't really what the Democrats wanted. It's more what the Republicans wanted. Same thing on the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act. Democrats wanted to do big things on gun control when they took control in 2021. Instead, what they got was a much more watered down bill that essentially was non-offensive to Republican senators who were willing to support modest steps that could be taken to try to reduce gun violence, or who were not willing to go as far as nationalizing background checks, banning certain types of weapons, and so on. Again, and this is the case where Republicans may not have wanted to do anything at all. The circumstances motivated them to engage, and they were more or less able to dictate what those terms were going to be because they knew they could walk away at any time and it would mean a lot more, or be a lot more of a loss for Democrats than it would be for Republicans to not take action on guns. Okay. So given all this, about how Congress gets things done, how majorities try to get things done in Washington, how parties engage to try to get things done. What should we expect from the coming 118th Congress that'll seat in January 2023 after the 2022 midterms? Well, some of it will depend on who wins and who loses. It's almost a near certainty that we're going to have some form of divided government. The question is mainly, will Republicans just take the House, or they also find a way to take the Senate? But even with divided government, plenty of things will happen. There also tends to be a myth that divided government simply means gridlock, that it means the parties will fight, that the new majority will investigate the president, that they will all pivot towards electioneering towards the 2024 presidential election. And of course, there will be plenty of that type of stuff. But also, plenty of things happen during divided government, and there tend to be plenty of legislative and major policymaking successes that happen during divided government every time we have it. Again, we've had divided government for about 70% of years since 1980. And it's not as if nothing happens during those 70% of years. In fact, a lot of big things happen. Just from our data on what parties wanted to do, what majority parties wanted to do, we only see modest differences between majority parties' rates of success and failure on their agenda items between unified and divided government. During unified government, majority parties get about 57% of their items done in some form. They have some success to claim on 57% of their items. It's lower, but it's 48% during divided government. That's not a huge gap. That means they still, whether it's unified or divided government, majority parties tend to get about half of what they want. Slightly more than half during unified, ever so slightly less than half during divided. Not a big change. One thing you can say, thinking about Barack and Taurus, is that steamrolls are only likely to happen during divided government if one side capitulates. Remember that list of steamrolls I showed you? The ones in red are all ones that happen during divided government. There's only one example of like a classic jam it down their throat steamroll during divided government on this left side, and that was PAYGO. And that's because PAYGO did not require a presidential signature, essentially just a congressional budget rule. So House and Senate Democrats could pass it, and they didn't need to get the presidency. They didn't need to get President Bush involved. Over here is more relevant. You see nearly almost all of these capitulations happen during divided government. What this tells you is that if you're going to see either party steamroll the other, it's going to be because the other party thinks it is a bad idea politically to continue to oppose the thing that they oppose, which would usually mean some turn of events makes that opposition suddenly embarrassing, which is what happened in a lot of these cases. But we should also look for points of agreement between the parties. We should look for and expect there will be some agreement on policies where both parties want to legislate, but they also aren't miles apart. There are certain things that you are very unlikely to see them legislate on, things like abortion, for instance, a lot of social and cultural issues where the parties are so far apart it's hard to bring them together. However, there are plenty of things where they have disagreements, but where there is a potential opportunity. To try to figure out what those things are, you got to look at what the parties are promising. Democrats are going to give you the same type of list if they maintain control of the Senate. It's going to be a lot of the things that they're saying they want to do now, things they haven't accomplished, which is a lot of things. Because it's their list at the start of the 117th Congress was very nearly identical to the list at the start of the 116th. This is their agenda right now. Republicans recently just put out a campaign document that sort of lays out, at least House Republicans did, oh, here's what we would do if we were given control. And just like the Democrats, here's what we would do. This is a list of pretty ambitious stuff. It's also kind of vague, because they just want it to sound nice at this point. They'll have to refine these if they take control. But among other things, the GOP's Commitment to America plan is to reduce federal regulations, promote energy independence, promote American industry competitiveness against China, increase border enforcement and close immigration loopholes, hire 200,000 new police officers nationwide, increase military spending, pass a Parents' Bill of Rights and allow parents to have more choice for where their kids go to school, lower health care costs and expand telemedicine, safeguard the Second Amendment, eliminate proxy voting in the House, and tighten up all sorts of aspects about how Congress has been doing its business in recent years. So what's there if we look at their two agendas? Where is there some nexus? Well, there are some things that both sides might want to act on. One of these is police reform. Police reform has been under negotiations between Democrats and Republicans since summer 2020. Democrats want to change some stuff about policing. Republicans want to change some stuff about policing. And very importantly, both sides recognize that there is a problem of policing in the country. They don't necessarily agree on the solutions, but they agree there is a problem. And that opens the door for negotiations. Cory Booker and some other Republican senators have been negotiating on this for some time. They keep running into things that stop them or slow them down because police unions will oppose it, or police reform groups will not like something the Republicans want to propose. But at least the effort is there, and the agreement on there being a problem is there, which is often a precursor to something. I believe at some point Congress will pass some sort of police reform bill. They didn't get it done this Congress. Maybe they'll get it done next Congress. Though the old adage in Washington is it takes 5 to 7 years to do anything. So we're maybe a ways away. Both sides are really interested in continuing to invest in American industry competitiveness, especially against China. They already did that a little bit this Congress because both sides want to do it. They're likely to do it again next Congress. This wasn't something that's on the Democrats' agenda. It's not something they put out there for their platform, but Republicans do, which may mean there's a greater focus on it. It means the likelihood that something happens on this is higher. Both sides, interestingly, have quietly become supportive of doing more energy research and development, including around clean energy. This is a secret. The Republicans in Washington don't want you to know that they've been quietly supporting research and development on clean energy for the last few years. They just don't want to talk about it. Democrats are happy to talk about it. But both sides have recognized that this is probably in American interests. This is something that helps consumers. It's probably something that's necessary in the long term. So you'll probably see more quiet legislating on R&D for clean energy. The child tax credit is something that we lost through negotiations. The Build Back Better plan wanted to keep it and expand it. Instead, it was shrunk back down because of inaction. But there is bipartisan support for expanding the child tax credit to some degree. Democrats want to expand it a lot. Some moderate Republicans want to expand it a little. Mitt Romney, senator from my state, from Utah, has a plan on the books to expand the child tax credit. Why would he do that? You don't know anything about Utah? More children than any other country, any other state in the country. So it's good for Utahns to expand it. And there are a lot of other Republican-heavy states where there are a lot of children and a lot of families who could use this. The precursor for getting this done is there. Both sides just have to be willing to get not exactly what they want on the child tax credit. And finally, maybe something with education reform. Our national education policies technically expired in 2020. That's not a big deal. Things always expire in Washington, and they just sort of keep them going through continuing reauthorizations. But it means that the education committees have probably already been spending time trying to figure out what changes do we want to make to the Every Student Succeeds Act, which is the current large education package. And the COVID-19 pandemic made a lot of people on both sides of the aisle see some of the flaws in our public education system. So there's a precursor there again for both sides to want to act. The committees are probably already doing some of the grunt work to try to eventually replace the Every Student Succeeds Act, but both sides are going to have to figure out how to move past some of the things they've entrenched themselves on, which tend to be aspects of the education policy world that have been tied to cultural issues where both sides can never seem to come to agreement. And then there's also things that are left over from this Congress. Right now, Congress is trying to move on with an Electoral Account Act reform. They're trying to move on Stock Act, which would ban stock trading among members of Congress and their families. These things may or may not get done this winter, and if they don't, you're likely to see them next time. And the last thing you should know is there will be plenty of surprises. There are always lots of things that pass that no one anticipates, including things like a couple of years ago raising the age to buy tobacco to 21. No one really saw that coming, but we got it. So you should always know there's going to be lots of things no one's anticipating that are coming your way. So final thoughts. So lawmakers have long known that compromise is necessary in Washington. You can find quotes from all sorts of luminaries from Washington talking about compromise is the name of the game. It's how things get done. It's a paradox of sorts. People come here with ideals, and this place reinforces their idealism. But Congress is an institution of compromise. It's the antithesis of idealism. This has long been what people said in Washington, and it's no less true today than it was in the past. We just live in a far more contentious political atmosphere. So what we should take away from this is that parties are rarely able to achieve their wildest ambitions, but every year they enact new policies in Congress. And most of these successes require compromises that both sides may not be happy to have to agree to, but some of the time they do. And we should expect the same after the midterms and in the next Congress. Thanks.
Okay. We have about 15 minutes for some Q&A. Maybe I'll start us off. I have a quick coding question.
Yeah.
Technical coding question. And then I have a more substantive question about divided government. My coding question is, I noticed that you had Obamacare as a steamroll,
Yeah.
but the Inflation Reduction Act as a back down.
Yeah.
How do you code the difference in those two? Because it seems to me Obamacare could have been a back down
Yeah.
as well, because they want, a lot of Democrats wanted a single payer system or at least a
Yeah.
public option. They had to back down, right?
Yeah.
So how do you distinguish between those two? And then my second question is more substantive. It has to do with divided government versus unified government. You show that there's not that much difference in terms of the majority party getting its agenda enacted. But I wonder if that has to do with the fact that during periods of divided government, the majority party's agenda shrinks a lot. They're not so ambitious. So the majority party doesn't come out with such ambitious plans, knowing they have to face a Senate or a House of the other party or a president of the other party, right? So those are my two questions.
I'll take the second one first, because that is sometimes true, but then other times the inverse is true. So when Democrats took control of the House in 2018, they put out a massive agenda. I think knowing they couldn't do most of it, but they wanted to set a marker on, like, here's all the things we would do if you just put us in charge, which carried directly over into the current Congress. So sometimes you do see them sort of, especially after repeated years of divided government, you see both sides kind of be like, well, maybe you got to be a little bit less ambitious with what they put forward. But the inverse is in those years where a party first takes back control of one chamber or of Congress, they tend to put out a massive agenda. And you saw this in 2018 with Democrats. You also saw it in 2010 with the Republicans. Some of these big pivotal years, 2006 with the Democrats and 94 with the Republicans. All those years, the majority had massive agendas, or the new majority had massive agendas, but they were facing at least a president opposed from the other side. And those are also years where you see a lot of failure before they readjust. So it's a mix. To your first question about coding that case, that coding is admittedly preliminary because Francis and I have to come to an agreement when the Congress is over about how it's coded. But our threshold for calling something like clear victory and a steamroll has been largely, is it being presented by journalists in the media and by party elites as a big time win? Did they get enough of what they wanted to be able to spike the football? And with Obamacare, even though it dropped important aspects that a lot of liberals wanted, it was still seen as this massive generational victory for the Democratic Party, arguably their biggest victory in 40 years at that point. So even though they had to back off stuff, you still had this wow, look what they did, or at least that's how it was presented. The Inflation Reduction Act, I think, is being presented as a disappointment, and admittedly as a disappointment to a lot of Democrats, because it's nowhere near what they initially proposed with Build Back Better. And so it is a funny case, because rarely when they back off that much are they unable to get some bipartisan support. But in that case, they backed off a ton, more or less to win over 2 or 3 Senate Republicans or Senate Democrats. That I at this point I am not comfortable calling it a steamroll, because it's just nowhere near what they said they wanted at the start. But it is preliminary at this point. Well, Francis and I will have to go back and forth if we disagree. I don't know. I haven't talked to her about that case yet. It's a good question.
Questions?
I'm sorry, I missed, what was the American Rescue Plan again?
American Rescue Plan was the big COVID relief bill that Democrats passed in March 2021, right after.
Do you know why they had to steamroll?
They didn't want to compromise. That was a clear case the majority didn't have to and didn't want to. Because Republicans, there were some Senate, especially Senate Republicans, who wanted to do something on COVID, but they wanted to be way less ambitious. And Democrats knew their only holdout was Joe Manchin, and they figured they could just figure out what he was willing to agree to. It gets basically twice as much as what Romney and some of the other Republicans were offering.
Kind of going back to the very start of the presentation, can we necessarily measure congressional productivity through empirical measures? Kind of goes back to the Mansfield's like factory problem. Can we really judge the Congress like a factory and just like producing laws and judge how effective it is by the number of laws or number of pages of laws enacted? Can we necessarily do that, or is that
Probably not in full, and that's in part why a lot of this is just focused on like parties, like successes, rather than Congress as a whole. Because I think it's a lot harder to say is Congress being productive enough or successful or not or whatever through these metrics, because there's always lots of things out there that it could do or maybe shouldn't do on the flip side that are harder to assess this way. But with the parties, I think we can more easily say, like, they're pretty transparent usually about what they want to do, and then we can take stock of, well, did a party in Congress achieve what it wanted as a whole, or not? But even as that one slide showed you, there's all these other things always going on in Congress that are harder to pick up on until they're done. And so I don't think that's enough to fully assess Congress, but I think it can be done for assessing what the majority wanted.
I think Biden recently said that, like, if you really want the Democrats to pass their agenda, you should give them like 52 seats in the Senate. So my question is mostly about, so you said that like the amount of steamrolling, if a party has a majority versus if it is a divided government, isn't that different? But my question would be, like, would the size of the majority affect it, and by how much?
I think for it, we don't find that it ever makes much difference for a number of reasons. I think there's a hypothetical scenario where one party got 60 some odd seats in the Senate, and those 60 some odd Democrats, Republicans were all perfectly unified on what they wanted to do. But the problem is these things are usually in tension. As you tend to gain more seats in the majority, you tend to have more diversity of opinion in the majority by necessity, which means you tend to lose some of that unity on the majority side, which means you still need the minority just as much. In fact, it might actually even be harder because now the minority is more like cohesive because they've shrunk. This is what you saw in the 111th Congress. Democrats briefly had 60 Senate seats, but they were barely ever able to get all 60 Democratic senators on board at the same time. Because by the time you get that big, you have some Democratic senators who are like, whoa, I don't want to do those things. I mean, you can see that now. So I think that's good messaging for an election to say, like, give me a couple more senators and we'll get stuff done. But history has not borne that out. Just because as you just never have the sufficient unity in the majority to actually just push things through. In fact, this is something Frances alluded to last week when she was here, like, about half the time when the majority fails, it's because they could not unify behind what they wanted to do and had nothing to do with opposition from the other side. And I think we have found consistently in these data that reason for failure tends to amp up as the majority's numbers get bigger.
Quick follow-up, so like, do you think the cohesiveness decreasing as a majority increases? Do you think that's because simply more people are being elected, or do you think it's a function
where you have to win? Like, think about where Democrats could pick up seats right now. They hold all the Senate seats in like the most liberal states. So they'd have to pick up a seat in Ohio or Iowa or North Carolina. And those Democratic senators are not going to be as liberal as Democratic senators from California or New York or Massachusetts, because they represent a very different state and they're going to need to take a very different tack. As you shrink, you lose seats, you're left with just your more hardcore senators. And it's the same on the Republican side. When they pick up seats, they have to pick them up in Rust Belt states or states where it can't be quite as extreme and hold on. And that's just a fundamental tension. It's the same in the House too. You're always picking up lots of seats, you're picking them up in cross-cutting seats that maybe like typically vote on the other side, and those representatives are not going to be as enthusiastic about doing things that are very, very liberal or very, very conservative.
Yeah, so Francis Lee last week talked a lot about how inter-party conflict is a big problem at the moment. And then you talked about how certain issues that have become more prevalent, such as the environment or police violence, brings parties together. So my question is, I guess, do you think these problems, as they persist, on the intra-party level, do you think they will divide or bring these parties together? Because you can see that that they can bring the two parties closer, but what does that mean on the internal?
Yeah, I mean, you tend to see sometimes this paradox of things that where you can find that cross-party support tend to also divide each party, which is sort of an interesting pattern because you often have things pass where it's the centers against the ends,
Right.
Because that's what enables that broad bipartisan support in the first place. Whether or not that's like ever systematic from issue to issue or just sort of like shifts over time, I think it's harder to say. Like 10 years ago, on the environment, you said like, oh, Republicans are just straight up opposed to these things, and the real problem was Democrats couldn't hold themselves together. I think what's shifted is you have more Republicans who are willing to be like, okay, I'll go along with some of this.
For sure.
So then Democrats don't have to get everyone behind it, or they probably do by the time they're done negotiating with Republicans. But I don't know if that answers your question, but like I think there's a pattern there, but I think on which issues it happens kind of constantly evolves.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
You said that military spending, is that not a democratic thing that they would push?
Democrats tend to want to spend less.
Do you think that the Russia and Ukraine conflicts that would motivate them to invest more in military spending?
It already has.
Okay.
We've already seen the defense authorization that's working through Congress this year is going to be a substantial increase because it's those types of events that lead both parties to be like, well, maybe we need to make sure there's sufficient investment here. After 9/11, you had a case where Democrats had been aggressively messaging, pre 9/11, the 90s, Democrats were aggressively trying to cut the Defense Department's budget. Republicans were actually having a hard time making the argument to keep the budget large during the late 1990s because the Cold War was over, we didn't seem to have any threats, why are we spending so much on the military? And then 9/11 happened, and Republicans were able to make a very convincing argument that we should spend more, and Democrats didn't really want to spend more, but also didn't think they could make a case to spend less anymore, so they just kind of went along with it, even though they were not very happy. This moment with Ukraine, I think both sides are concerned and want to push up the defense budget a little bit.
Do you know why they don't want to spend on the military?
They'd rather spend the money on domestic priorities. And for a long time in Washington, that's kind of how it's worked. If you spend more on one, you spend less on the other. You try to keep deficits under control. So in the last few years, that has completely fallen apart, where for a long time they had these caps on each that tried to keep them in balance that were sort of informally negotiated between Democrats and Republicans that allowed for them to come to broad budget agreements because all budget agreements need bipartisan support. And COVID essentially obliterated this delicate balance, and now we're just spending like crazy again. And then just on both sides, and both sides are just he's turned from a delicate balance to a log roll, where the Republicans are like, we'll let you spend all that money if you let us spend it over here in defense. And then everyone's like, cool, money's just keep printing it. What could go wrong? That's where we're at. It's like the 1970s all over again. Yeah.
I don't know. Secondary is kind of a twofold question, but why do we feel that Congress is less productive than ever? And I guess another, kind of somewhat related point is, how is the rise of closed rules in the House and effectively closed rules in the Senate with unanimous consent agreements and the like will harm the institution it made us feel and if that is that?
Okay, so those are tightly interrelated. We'll go with the first one first because I don't think we have a full answer to it yet. This is actually what Francis, Lee, and I have pivoted to. Now our current project is about trying to understand this very question of if Congress is still productive, if most of what it does is still bipartisan, why is media coverage not reflect that? We did an initial paper where we just looked at the COVID-19 relief bills from 2020, all of which were bipartisan, all of which had no bickering, all of which were unprecedented in size and scope to deal with a clear problem that Americans wanted action on, and they all happened quickly. Basically, it was a microcosm of this is what people say they want Congress to do. They want them to see a problem, come together, come up with a solution, and pass it, and do so in an aggressive manner. And they did. The media coverage was still negative. And so we're trying to use that as an initial lens to understand why, even when it does what you say you want it to do, why is coverage of Congress still this negative lens? And we have some working theories on it, but I don't think we know the answer yet. But that's sort of where we pivoted after this, because I think it's the logical, well, then why do we all think this? Why are we told this? Part of it is I think it just fits into the meatiest framework of Congress. They've built a conceptual framework that Congress fights and doesn't get things done, and so they look for things to write about that fit that framework. And conflict sells, telling people hey, everyone got along today. Doesn't. To the other question about closed rules, I think it does. So I think closed rule. I think these basically, or a broader way we could think about it is unorthodox legislating procedures. This shift towards a centralized Congress that doesn't have the kind of open public deliberations it did, is a double-edged sword, because I think that shift has enabled Congress to still be productive, because the old way of doing things, this regular order where they have open and freewheeling debate and amendment in committees and on the floor, made it too easy for opponents to kill things, which is why they tightened it up. But then it always looks bad, right? So it looks like Congress isn't deliberating, and it looks like members of Congress aren't doing their job, and it looks like everything is secretive and controlled from the outside. So it helps them maintain productivity, but it's terrible for public relations. So I think it's actually help the institution get things done under a very difficult political environment, but on the other hand, makes it easier for people to hate on Congress because it doesn't look like they're having real legislative deliberations anymore. And they are, it's just all happening behind the scenes where you can't see it, which is not good if you want to convince the American public that you are doing what your job is.
Okay, I'm afraid our time's up. Before I thank our guests, let me remind you we have another in our series on the midterm elections next week, same time, same place. We have Allison Gash from the University of Oregon who will be talking about LGBTQ issues in the election. So join us then. Now join me in thanking Jim Curry for a really interesting